afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law News produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. I'm joined by my colleagues Peter Wright and Heather Anson, and we're just going to run through some news stories which have been coming up this week. I'll pass over to Peter and Heather to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started.
Thank you very much, Amelia. My name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and the Managing Director at Digital Law, and got some quite meaty news stories to be able to share with everyone this week and give some comment on, and also very pleased to be able to welcome Heather back on the podcast.
Hi, thank you. And as I said, I'm Heather Anson. I'm Managing Director at Anson Evaluate, the producers of this lovely podcast. Also a specialist legal consultant, and they are thankfully letting me back on this week to give my opinions and insights on the story at the top of the podcast today.
Thanks, Heather. So we'll dive right into that. So our first story today is about the Elon Musk Twitter story. I mean, there's so many facets here that we can kind of look at. But I will pass over to Heather to dive into the kind of main issue of free speech here.
Sure. Well, I think that's been one of the centerpieces of this, is because Elon Musk is considered a free speech apostle. He really pushes for openness and free speech, and they think because he's going to do that, it's going to become just sort of this battleground. Twitter is just going to be an open source for any garbage anyone wants to throw on there, and that this is going to be bad. But then he's going to also run into the regulations in Europe, and so that he may not be able to do that in the way he wants. And I think the perspective that I'm bringing is that in the US, we do have a much probably broader free speech rights point of view, based on our case law and our history and experience. But there is still, it's not a free-for-all, and it never has been. And I don't know that Elon Musk would agree it's a free-for-all. The background I have with free speech and hate speech in particular has to do with I've worked in legislation before, in legislative drafting, and and also in teaching. And I thought it would be an interesting experiment to do some workshops with students, law students in particular, and see what they thought a hate speech legislation would look like. In particular, defining what hate speech would be, and whether it would be punished, how you would legislate it, period. And I remember having another professor tell me that he would just turn in an empty sheet of paper because he doesn't think there should be anything. And I said, no, I had a group that did something better than that, which is they came back and said that anyone who complained about something online or speech that they disagreed with and thought it was hate speech, that they would actually be asked to take courses on tolerance and lessons in what free speech really is. And I think that was it was very bold and brave perspective for them, because most of the students would come back with, oh yeah, we'll make it a civil fine, and this is what hate speech is, against speaking against someone's race, religion, and it's like, well, it's a very dangerous and simplistic way of looking at it, because when we say, oh, you can't say these things, it's a way of stifling conversation, and when you stifle conversation, it can actually cause it to go and fester underground and become much worse. And I give the example of in Germany, where they for years outlawed, and decades for understandable reasons, outlawed any discussions of Nazis and white supremacy and things like that. And they actually saw a growth in that. Despite, they thought, okay, if we suppress this, then we won't have this. But what actually happened was, because you're not allowed to have a free discourse of it, people thought, oh, they're just trying to hide what the truth is, and that tends to be a reaction sometimes. A counter, I would say, to that is understanding what is really harmful speech, what really should be thought of to be taken down, versus what should really be allowed, even as we find it incredibly distasteful, what possibly we should just let happen for the sake of being able to at least see where it is and see where it's coming from, and in some cases even counter it and be able to, for lack of a better term, talk people off the ledge of where they are. A good example of this is one I got from a talk from a free speech advocate in the U.S. She used to run the American Civil Liberties Union, which defended quite a few. That's one of their main things, is defending people on free speech matters. And she said one of the most important cases she ever did was for an organization which she absolutely abhors. What they talk about and what they promote is something she is very, very much against, but she believed it was their fundamental right to at least say what they were saying. And what it was is a group called the North American Man-Boy Love Association, or NAMBLA, which advocates for sexual relationships between adult men and adolescent to teenage boys for the purposes of bringing them into manhood. It's a very it's actually an oddly old-fashioned, when I say old-fashioned, like ancient Greece type idea that used to be thought of as how you would bring a man into manhood would be to be guided by another man, and they very much believe in that and wanted to promote it. But her point was, is as much as I disagree with what they're saying, they have a right to say it. They weren't facilitating pedophilia. They weren't posting child pornography images. They were literally just having the discussion. So the distinction there is between having a discussion or allowing people to talk about or have opinions that we really, really dislike, and being able to say things that are really personally we find disgusting, or maybe even most people would find disgusting, is different than posting things like atrocities, posting things like child pornography, which are going to be more clear-cut cases. And I don't think Elon Musk, as much as he is a free speech advocate, would say that that's okay to put, that he wants Twitter to be a free-for-all in that way. I think he wants just from what I know of his history, in that he wants something that's a little bit more around the American model. And I don't think he believes that banning people for life, such as Donald Trump, really fits into that ethos of free and open discourse that exists in the United States. And I think that's the perspective that's kind of scaring people, because that's something we're not necessarily that knowledgeable about. Sorry, any questions? I've just been talking.
No, I was just thinking that's interesting that you've referred to Trump there, because there's been a lot of people wondering if this could mean that he makes a return for the platform if the ban that he received in January 2021 is rescinded. Though I did read one report this week saying that whether Twitter decides to let him on or not, he won't be, and there's some other social media platform that he's said he's going to go on.
Yeah, he's created a new platform called Truth, and he thinks that's way better. But I think you'll probably find that on that website, you'll have that social media site, you'll have either the same problems that you have on other social media sites, where people will be people and say horrible things, or you'll have the type of censorship in the opposite direction to what he feels you have on Twitter.
Yeah.
There's the idea that Twitter is censoring conservative voices, and he doesn't want to censor conservative voices, but then our liberal voice is going to be censored on his social media network.
And it also opens up the possibility that even if he weren't to jump on there now in 2022, if we end up in a world where Trump makes another presidential run, it might be that he can't resist having a presence again on Twitter, because arguably he hasn't been able to engage with the given that he ran his whole presidency seemingly on Twitter, the fact that he's not had that tool at his disposal has probably limited what he's been able to do over the last 2 years. And if he did want to reach out more broadly, then it might mean him back on Twitter and tweeting at 3 a.m. As seemed to be his want during 2016 to 2020.
And I think, we talk about misinformation, pretty much poster child of that would be Trump. And the idea is Twitter really supposed to be the policeman for misinformation, or is there a different way of going about that? And certain types of information, if you post it, if it's found to be willfully inaccurate, there are ways of coming at that in court or otherwise. So it's a question of how much do we want this privately owned social media platform to be the police of this, as opposed to making it more an individual empowerment, both ways.
Yeah, and I think it's with this as well, while Musk may want to have that sort of clean sheet of paper in terms of these other rules, or very, very limited ones, he may see this as a simple challenge that the current management of Twitter have simply made overcomplicated and applied what he sees as ideological rules. But
there he might find a problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's, he's sort of, the phrase he keeps using is the idea of Twitter being the world's town square, and you should be able to express what you want in the town square. But what do you do when the thing being expressed is instructions being shared on how to put together a nail bomb? How do you limit the use of the platform for potentially broadcasting and live streaming terrorist acts as they are taking place, as happened in New Zealand a few years ago? There's quite major issues around that, and I think that's where the slippery slope potentially starts. You have to think about that. And
to be fair, with those examples you've given are actually clear cases where I say that's where in free speech in the US we say you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. So if it's something that is obviously harmful, there is that is pretty clear cut, and I don't think we have. I don't think even the staunchest of free speech advocates would say it's okay to do any of those things that you say. Give instructions for a letter bomb or how to create anthrax. They wouldn't. They wouldn't say, oh yes, we want that. That's a very different thing than the town square. I think the more gray area that's going to be a problem is actually around misinformation. I think the extremes are pretty straightforward. It's when you say, well, is it their job to fix misinformation, or is it really on us to educate ourselves on how to really pop the bubbles we live in? And is that really the job of Twitter to police that, or is that a societal thing that we need to shift from?
Yeah. I mean, one of the tools that they've introduced recently is to say that before you end up, say, tweeting a link to an article, it will say, have you actually read this article before you share it? Because sometimes people do that, then they won't have read it, and it'll start off a bun fight that people will not have actually understood the fact that they were sort of tweeting something fairly incendiary. They've just looked at the headline and think that is what the whole article is about, when it could be a lot more detailed.
But have they done any studies?
Arguably encouraging people to do that.
How's that actually worked? Has that done anything?
Well, it seems to, at least I think it's actually making people perhaps at least stop and think before sharing. And
do we know that?
The descriptions that I'm seeing from people online are saying actually at least people are more cognizant perhaps of what they share.
Well, that's what we hope is happening. I don't know that, at least now that that's actually what's happening, because it's the same thing like with cookie preferences. People just hit, yeah, okay, whatever, I'll take the cookies, because we just don't want to have to deal with that. If they didn't read the article to begin with, reminding them, oh, have you read this? Is it really true? Is that going to make them really actually go back and read it? If they didn't have the patience to go and read it the first time, they're just going to be annoyed at Twitter for saying, what, you don't think I can't figure it out from just the headline? I'm going to post it anyway. So before I would say, yes, that's a good idea, Twitter's done this, and praise them for it, I'd want to see statistically to show that that's actually done any good, as opposed to have a form of backlash of people.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't necessarily praising it. I was just saying that's one of the things that they have done within this
Right.
last 12 months or so.
Right.
It's an example of the direction of travel of the outgoing management team, that it's one of the things that they've introduced that arguably is a symptom of them having tied themselves in knots over the issue of what you are or are not going to allow, and policing content in the way that has then led, I think, to Musk then leading this takeover.
And some of these things, because I don't believe they'll have that much of an impact, become more of a virtue signaling exercise than an actual beneficial aspect of Twitter. All right, so that's probably enough from me. Is there anything else you wanted to ask me about this Twitter thing? Otherwise, I'm going to leave you guys to it, so you can probably get this done in less than an hour and a half.
No, that's really great. Thanks ever so much, Heather, for sharing some insights there.
All right, thanks for having me on again.
Thanks, Heather.
Bye-bye.
So moving on to our next story. This is looking at the Ward Hadaway hack, which happened last week. So top 100 law firm Ward Hadaway was blackmailed for up to 4.75 million in Bitcoin after confidential documents were obtained in a cyber attack, the High Court has heard. So the firm detected the cyber attack last month and was told by the hacker that files and data downloaded from its IT system would be published online if the ransom was not paid within a week, and it would then be doubled. The hacker also sent Ward Hadaway a list of data files which had been copied in the attack, some of which had already been uploaded to the web in encrypted form. So Ward Hadaway was granted an injunction against person or persons unknown responsible for engaging in a cyber attack on the firm and/or who is threatening to release the information thereby obtained, preventing the use or publication of stolen data. It's somewhat unclear as to the effect that this might have had, but I'll pass over to Peter to continue with this.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, this is an interesting story. We've already covered on this podcast the fact that the law firm Tucker's had a cyber attack in 2020, and they've now been on the receiving end of a monetary penalty notice from the ICO. But of course, that took 2 years of investigation and enforcement to get that far. In this instance, we're hearing about a very recent attack, and we're getting the immediate information here because Ward Hadaway have chosen to take out this injunction against those responsible for the hack. It does beg the question, however, how useful will this be in practice? Because it will have cost them an awful lot of money to go and get emergency injunctive relief at the High Court. And they've obviously had to then reveal a lot of quite sensitive information about how they were compromised and how they were blackmailed for $6 million in Bitcoin. And while they've got the injunctive relief, which will in theory mean that means that we can stop the information that's been shared through any traditional means online. So, for example, if any of the data that had been hacked then is published by a newspaper or on social media, you could take that injunction to the publisher and say, you've got to take this down because of the terms of the injunction. It would have use there, but in this instance, more than likely, any data that's been compromised will be published and shared on the dark web. And they tend not to take an awful lot of notice of injunctions, particularly if the hackers are overseas and the data's being exchanged overseas, and they'll say, and why should we listen to the High Court in the UK, in London? So this will be interesting just to see how this is applied. You know, is this injunction now used to take down something in a practical, measurable, useful way? Or is this a law firm thinking, we know how to use the law to look after our interests, and then finding that in fact this data ends up being shared, data is compromised, confidentiality, privilege, etc. breached, and it turns out the injunction really can't be of any much practical use? You can probably tell from the way I'm saying this that I suspect it might be the latter, and that in this instance that data, as is often the case with sort of stolen items, stolen material, it's shared on the dark web, and they're not going to be bound or take any practical notice of documents and injunctions being produced from the High Court. Watch this space. And the thing is here that this is a fairly recent hack. It happened in March of 2022. So they will have had to report this to the ICO if it involves personal data. It looks like the NCSC have already been involved. So now we'll just wait and look, will there be an investigation by the ICO? Will there be regulatory enforcement? The fact that the new UK Information Commissioner, John Edwards, seems to, with that Tucker's note of publication, it suggests that he is carrying through on the ICO's previous practice of holding law firms to a higher standard. So he might not be hugely impressed with the nature of this breach, and he indeed may end up expressing a view on the merits of running off to get an injunction rather than actually supporting potentially affected data subjects. So now let's watch over the next 6 to 12 months. What does the ICO choose to do, if anything?
Thanks, Peter. Sticking with kind of law firm hacks, the Bar Council and Bar Standards Board has also been hacked. IT systems operated by the Bar Council and the Bar Standards Board have been taken offline following the latest cyber attack on the legal profession in London. And so they've reported that they're doing all that they can to fix the problem, but emails and MyBar have been temporarily unavailable, and authorization to practice and court ID cards have also been extended due to this attack. This attack has been reported to the ICO and the NCSC, as well as the police here, and they've expressed deepest apologies for kind of this attack. And this kind of goes back to what Peter's already iterated here, but I will still pass over for further discussion.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, yeah, indeed, the similar issues around this. The fact that that system, MyBar, has gone down has meant that things like people's confidential login and ID, and then the fact that that system holds things like the professional court users' ID cards and authorizations to practice mean that there's lots and lots of very sensitive personal data and commercially confidential data in there that could potentially have been compromised. So the ICO will investigate, and we'll see what the consequences of that will be. This is in particular a bit of a salutary lesson for membership organisations. So, you know, representative bodies like, for example, the Law Society of England and Wales, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, Royal Institute of British Architects, other big membership organisations with lots and lots of personal data, where members are usually given the opportunity to log in to be able to update information or access information. Where you have that facility and the ability to access data, you are then at risk of that being compromised. So the very highest standards have to be applied. And then when, for example, a developer says there is a issue here and here is a patch or a solution or a fix, it's important to make sure that that solution is applied. Where there can be complexity with some of these systems is that, of course, when we're looking at, in this instance, the Bar Council and the Bar Standards Board, they will have historical information going back over a period of very many years. So very often they'll have had new websites, new systems, and for sometimes much older databases and systems are being required to then go through a front end that looks fairly modern and up to date, yet the back end handling of the data can sometimes be rather old, and sometimes it is difficult to get these older systems to speak to the new ones, and that's where there can be a complex mesh of patches and updates that are trying to ensure that the systems are properly talking to each other and delivering the functionality for the users. And sometimes in that rush to provide the user functionality, the security ends up being overlooked or compromised. We don't know what the cause of the hack is or what the vulnerability might be. This is the sort of thing that the ICO and the NCSC will be looking at. If there is found to have been, say, a recommendation from a developer that a patch or an update should have been applied and it hasn't been, that's the sort of thing that the ICO will take quite a dim view of. And that's one of the things I identified in the Tucker's monetary penalty notice that I was talking about in the last story. So now we've got to let the experts do their work. There'll have to no doubt be a sort of cyber forensic investigation to work out what data has been compromised and how and why. And also then the regulators will have to carry out their investigation, and then let's see if there has been a problem. We'll get perhaps a either at least some sort of enforcement and potentially a monetary penalty notice will follow. We'll have to wait and see.
Thanks, Peter. And moving on to our third hack this week. It's been a very busy week for the hackers, it appears. Coca-Cola has been hacked. So the Stormus hacking group posted on its website on Monday that it had hacked Coca-Cola's servers and retrieved 161 gigabytes of data. Among this data is supposedly financial data, passwords, as well as commercial accounts. The group is now trying to sell the data for about 16 million in Bitcoin. And this is actually coming after the group reportedly put up a poll on Telegram asking which company it should hack, which is fairly interesting here. They also vowed to support the Russian government's efforts in its invasion of Ukraine, which is quite a takeaway from this. I'll pass over to Peter.
Thanks, Amelia. Yeah, so this would appear to be a potential conflict, part of offshoot of the current geopolitical issues between Russia and the West. If someone puts a poll on Telegram, which is a message platform that no one should be using, certainly for business purposes or any general communication, because it has links to the Russian state. Yeah, if someone's using that to say, who should we hack next? I wouldn't trust that to be the most fair and open poll that's ever been carried out. And funnily enough, they chose to then target a big, large US corporation. Surprise, surprise. If anything, it's interesting they're only trying to sell the data for $640,000, when arguably you could try and get a lot more for that. 161 gig of data is a lot. However, the thing here as well is that it's not as though we're looking at vast amounts of personal data, actually. Given the nature of the product, of course, it's not as though you tend to go and buy a bottle of Coke through the website. So this is going to be something that the wholesalers and the different stores use for their corporate accounts. There will be personal data in there, but it's not going to be sort of people's individual payment card and credit card data that you'd say get if a big vendor like, say, Amazon was to be compromised, or a streaming service, for example. In this instance, it's all going to be, details about purchase invoices and purchase orders, invoices, sales receipts, shipping information. Very, very interesting to certain people in terms of the logistics behind that, but not of the same sort of commercial value that you would expect to see from a from the compromise of a more mass market platform that is directly selling to customers rather than the businesses. This is a B2B platform that appears to have been compromised. So who knows if they'll get their $640,000 or not. It does highlight, however, that of course any corporation is vulnerable, whether you're B2B or B2C. Your platform can be taken down. In this instance, it was because of what appear to be Russian hackers. But it just shows that even if you are a B2B platform, you can still be, someone like Coca-Cola, big, massive corporation, you'd expect that they would have fairly good levels of security and encryption present on their sites and on their platforms, yet this has still been compromised, it would appear. So no one is ever immune from being hacked. And it's just an object lesson in saying make sure that your systems are generally as secure as possible. And this is what the NCSC in particular has been saying since the Russian invasion began back in February, that we need to be ensuring that systems are kept properly secure and up to date because of the risk of being compromised. as a result of the high level of cyber warfare taking place between both sides, between Ukraine and Russia, which mean that highly engineered ransomware and other malicious cyber products can in effect end up being out there after they've been fired at each other, and they can end up taking down other systems. Or in this instance, you've had Russia, or some hackers in Russia, then deliberately looking at Western commerce and thinking, what should we take down next? So hence big items of commerce being vulnerable, and as usual, you can imagine items of critical national infrastructure are also at risk as a result.
Thanks, Peter. Moving kind of back to the legal profession here. So the lawyer who acted for Alex Salmond during his sex assault trial has been found guilty of professional misconduct for discussing the case on a train. So Gordon Johnson, QC, was caught on video making comments about the former First Minister and two of his accusers. A disciplinary panel decided the QC's conversation, which was leaked to a newspaper, breached a court order protecting the accusers' identities. Mr. Salmond was actually acquitted of the string of sexual offence charges. The penalty for Mr. Jackson's misconduct has yet to be determined, and it is open for him to seek an appeal. However, the video recording of the conversation was filmed by a fellow passenger on a train from Edinburgh to Glasgow. And this is during the 2-week trial in March 2020, and it does show the QC naming two of Mr. Salmond's accusers, despite strict rules that protect their anonymity. I can never say that word. So I'll pass over to Peter to discuss why this is fairly damning misconduct from a solicitor.
Thanks, Amelia. So this is indeed sort of the wrapping up of quite an old story now. Back in 2020, just as the pandemic restrictions were coming in March 2020, this trial wound up at the time, and Alex Salmond was not convicted after a sort of very sensational trial in Scotland. And at the time, the details of this conversation were published. It was sort of front page news in Scotland, as you can imagine, because this chap, Gordon Jackson, who was in fact had a leadership position within the Scottish Advocates, as well as being a sort of very senior, very well respected and renowned QC, did what I hear a lot of lawyers doing, which is to have loud conversations on a train and presume that no one's either listening, or very often I think lawyers, they tend to think that whoever's listening won't be competent or have the ability to understand the very complex legal issues that you're discussing. So I'm afraid I've done this before. I ended up actually recording lawyers on a train in Yorkshire, travelling between Leeds and Sheffield, and they were talking loudly about a case. I think it was a barrister and solicitor, and they were both talking very loudly, and I was on the table opposite, so I just got my phone out, proceeded to record them, and then at the end of it said, "You really shouldn't be doing that. I'm afraid I'm also a lawyer. You're discussing stuff." And their excuse was, "Oh, it's an open trial, it doesn't matter." And you're like, no, there is that whole thing of confidentiality. You aren't supposed to discuss this stuff in a public place. And that is exactly what happened in this instance. So it looks like this QC was on the train. And of course, where there's the problem is that the accusers in this case were covered by the veil of anonymity, the idea that those who make the allegation that their identities should not be published. So it shouldn't be it shouldn't be published, it shouldn't be in the public sphere, and yet he ended up discussing it, and that's where the problems have then come in. So that's why he's ended up being found guilty of professional misconduct in this instance. But it's a salutary lesson and a reminder to all lawyers, don't discuss this stuff in a public place. So you shouldn't be taking phone calls and talking loudly on a train or in a restaurant or in a bar or in a waiting room, you know, or in the departure lounge at an airport. This stuff, you know, we really do need to be careful and be mindful of our professional responsibilities when we are working remotely outside of the office. And that's why it's a matter of always thinking about can I be overheard? Perhaps not having this conversation in a public place. And in the same way, if you're answering emails in a public place, have a privacy screen on your laptop, or don't deal with that really personal, really important confidential email when you are working remotely. Perhaps that's something to do when you're back home or in a remote office somewhere. So it really is a very clear example of the fact that in this instance, it's even the very senior QC who spent a large part of his career telling other people how to be advocates that in this instance has made this very elementary mistake.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our last story of today. Schools have been offered cyber defences for free. So schools can now benefit from free cyber defence tools from the nation's leading experts to help them protect their emails and websites from online attackers. All UK schools are encouraged to sign up for MailCheck and WebCheck, two pioneering services that help organisations identify potential cybersecurity issues and fix them promptly. So these tools from the National Cybersecurity Centre, as part of GCHQ, have been rolled out to help schools defend against continuing threats from cyber criminals whose activities can put sensitive data at risk and affect institutions' reputations, as well as their ability to operate. And don't know whether you'll recall, but last year there were a fair few universities that had actually been hacked, and that led to both a delay in education services as well as a loss of personal data, particularly when we're thinking about universities where there's the whole financial side when it comes to students and student loans. There is a massive amount of personal data there. And actually this has seen a huge success. One university reported a 99% decline in the number of malicious spoof emails sent out during their domain in just 2 weeks after signing up for the MailCheck, and thousands of urgent web issues being fixed after education institutions were alerted by the WebCheck. So clearly these tools are actually working. So it's great to see that they have actually been implemented in schools. So I'll pass it over to Peter.
Thanks, Amelia. Yeah, really important to see that this is being done. Let's bear in mind that, of course, schools are processing large volumes of very sensitive special category personal data involving children, which is defined in the UK as anyone below the age of 13. So it is important that that information is kept secure. Yes, of course, schools have increasingly large networks because it is important that pupils get the opportunity to learn and learn using online technology, and indeed are fully conversant in its use, because that's how they're going to be working in the workplace. So for those who went to school in the 1970s, 80s and 90s, IT is now an integral part of the education system. And indeed, we all saw during the pandemic the need for then students of all ages to be able to learn remotely from home. So in some instances, schools were then providing laptops and providing equipment to pupils so that remote learning could continue in a fashion. And that's where then risk comes in. So it's good to see that these tools are being provided. This is one of the benefits of having the UK National Cybersecurity Centre. If I was being critical, I might have said, isn't this a little bit closing the stable door after the horse has bolted, when we've had, as I say, mass working from home in 2020. And it's only now that we're starting to think about the security of school networks and school information. Amelia, you're quite right that a number of universities have been targeted by ransomware attacks in the past. Indeed, I heard of one that ended up paying multiple ransoms so they could get the data back, which in itself is worrying, because that suggests that the university has not worked out the risks of being on the receiving end of a ransomware attack, and then the fact it happens again and again means that they aren't taking the right remedial measures to learn from the consequences of being compromised and making sure it doesn't happen again, which you'd hope wouldn't be the case in an academic institution, but we'll draw a veil over that. But the point here really is that at least this is happening, even if it is a little bit too late. So at least efforts are being made to shore up the cyber defences of the schools that are out there. But we've just got to hope that this isn't an end in itself, and that they're consequent always reviewing this arguably item of critical national infrastructure and ensuring that they are equipped with the defences to keep themselves safe as those advanced persistent threats continue to evolve in a landscape that we've seen over just the last few months is evolving very, very rapidly.
Thanks, Peter. So that was our last story for today. Big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this webinar, and thank you again to Heather for joining us on that first story. So I'll pass over to Peter because he will be joining Heather again on our new CPD courses, and I'll pass over to Peter to go through that in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Amelia. Yes, so we're doing a course of 12 webinars, and the first one is on the 5th of May, and it covers cybersecurity ransomware. We'll be going into that in a lot of detail. We're doing 4 webinars on cybersecurity. We're doing another 4 on data protection, and then 4 on the digital economy. So things like the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, CMA regulation, and also then things like NFTs, cryptocurrency, blockchain, social media law, etc. So, you know, lots of real detail and real helpful detail there. And the fact that we're doing that course of 12 means that we'll actually get to go into a lot more depth than we do on these quick discussions that we have each week. So if people are interested, please go along and register. So you can find the information if you go to Digital Law's Facebook page, Anson Evaluate's Facebook page. Just search for both of those names on Facebook, it'll come up. Same on LinkedIn, same on Twitter. Or you can just go to ansonevaluate.com or digitallawuk.com, and you can then register and get your login information so you can join us for that first webinar on the 5th of May. And it would be really great to be able to have some of our listeners with us, or even viewers if you're watching us on YouTube, with us for that course.
Thanks, Peter. So we will be back next week. Just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, YouTube channel, podcast channels as well, such as Spotify, Apple Music and Amazon Music. So thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.